The March morning in 2024 started like any other for the Park Service dive team at Yellowstone Lake. They were conducting routine sonar sweeps, checking for debris after the unusually warm winter had caused unprecedented ice melt. The readings showed something metallic, large, approximately 60 feet below the surface in the West Thumb area. What they discovered would unravel a 30-year-old mystery that had haunted Wyoming since 1994. Before we begin the story, write in the comments which city you're from. We're very interested to know where you're watching our video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. The sonar operator noticed the anomaly first. "That's definitely a vehicle," he said, studying the screen. The shape was unmistakable, a pickup truck sitting upright on the lake bottom. Within hours, specialized recovery equipment arrived. As the crane slowly lifted the 1994 Ford F-150 from its watery grave, water streamed from the cab windows. The license plate, though corroded, was still readable. Wyoming plates, registered to Theodore Frost. Theodore Teddy Frost had been 22 years old in February 1994. A skilled fishing guide, he knew Yellowstone Lake better than most locals. His best friend since childhood, Daniel Rivers, 24, worked as a mechanic at the only garage in West Yellowstone. Christopher Winters, just 21, was a college student from Bozeman, new to their fishing group but eager to learn. On February 12, 1994, these three young men had set out for a day of ice fishing. Only one person returned, Mason Sterling, then 23, now a successful businessman at 53. For 3 decades, Mason Sterling had told the same story. The ice had cracked unexpectedly. The truck had broken through. He'd tried desperately to save his friends, but the current under the ice was too strong. He'd barely escaped with his own life, pulling himself from the freezing water and walking 7 miles back to town, arriving at the ranger station at 7 that evening, hypothermic and in shock. The search teams found nothing. The lake had swallowed them whole, or so everyone believed. The discovery of the truck changed everything. Park Service investigators immediately noticed several unusual details. The truck's position didn't match Mason's original statement. He'd reported the incident happening near the western shore, but the vehicle was found at the northern end of the lake, miles from where he'd claimed. The truck sat perfectly upright, not on its side as might be expected if it had broken through ice while moving. Most puzzling, the windows were rolled up tight. Inside the truck, investigators found more than just the remains of 3 young men. A cassette recorder, sealed in a waterproof case, had survived 3 decades underwater. Several watches, frozen at different times. A journal wrapped in plastic. Christopher's camera, the film still in its canister. And oddly, a Zippo lighter with an engraving. To Mason, Love Dad, 1993. A gift Mason Sterling had claimed he'd lost that tragic day. The news reached Mason Sterling at his office in Jackson Hole. The successful real estate developer, now in his early 50s, immediately offered his full cooperation. "I've waited 30 years for closure," he told investigators, his voice breaking with emotion. "Teddy was like a brother to me. I've lived with survivor's guilt every day since." He volunteered DNA samples, old photographs, anything that might help identify the remains. He even offered to pay for the most advanced forensic analysis available. Evelyn Blackwood, who had been 20 years old in 1994 and Teddy's girlfriend at the time, was now 50 and recently retired from the Park Service herself. When investigators contacted her, she revealed something she'd kept quiet for 3 decades. Teddy was running a side business, she said carefully. Cash-only fishing tours for wealthy clients who wanted to fish in restricted areas. He kept it completely off the books. I warned him it was dangerous, not just legally, but because of the money involved. We're talking $50,000 in cash that winter alone. The forensic team worked methodically through the evidence. The cassette tape, remarkably preserved by the cold water and its waterproof case, contained a recording from the morning of February 12, 1994. The 4 friends' voices, young and full of life, discussing the day's plans. Teddy's voice, confident and experienced, talking about ice conditions. Daniel joking about the coffee Mason had brought. "This tastes weird, man. What did you put in it?" Christopher, eager and asking questions about the best spots. And Mason, helpful and friendly, suggesting they try the northern section because he'd heard the fish were biting there. 3 days before the tragedy, witnesses remembered an argument at the Grizzly Bar in West Yellowstone. The topic had been money. Several patrons heard raised voices, though the exact words were unclear. Teddy had been there with Daniel. Mason arrived later, and there was visible tension. Christopher hadn't been present. He was still in Bozeman, planning to drive up that Friday for the weekend fishing trip. The bartender remembered Mason buying rounds for everyone after Teddy and Daniel left, smoothing things over, being his usual charming self. The timeline of February 12, 1994, began to take shape through various witness statements and records. At 5:30 that morning, the owner of the bait shop saw all 4 men loading gear into Teddy's truck. They seemed in good spirits. Mason was carrying a large thermos of coffee. At 11 that morning, Teddy had made a radio check-in with another guide on the lake. Everything was normal. The last confirmed sighting of the truck was at 1:30 that afternoon by a cross-country skier who noticed it parked on the ice in the northern section. By 7 that evening, Mason Sterling stumbled into the ranger station alone. The 3 watches found in the truck provided a disturbing detail. They had stopped at different times, 2:18, 2:24, and 2:30. This suggested the tragedy hadn't been instantaneous. The medical examiner, working with what evidence remained after 30 years, noted that all 3 victims were found in seated positions, still wearing seat belts. This was highly unusual for an accident where a vehicle broke through ice. Typically, victims would attempt to escape, to break windows, to swim for safety. Christopher's camera contained a roll of film that had been preserved by the cold water. Modern techniques allowed some of the images to be recovered. Most were typical fishing trip photos. The friends smiling, holding equipment, scenic shots of the lake. But the last 3 frames, time-stamped at 2:05 p.m., showed something extraordinary. Mason Sterling, standing on the ice about 50 feet from the truck, holding an ice auger. In the background, multiple holes were visible in the ice. These weren't fishing holes. They formed a deliberate pattern around where the truck was parked. Teddy's journal, found in a plastic bag under the seat, revealed the full extent of his illegal guide operation. Names of wealthy clients, dates, amounts paid, locations visited. The final entry, dated February 11, 1994, read, "Mason's been asking too many questions about the money. Dan thinks I'm being paranoid, but something feels off. He knows I've been saving to buy the marina. He keeps joking about being partners, but his jokes don't sound like jokes anymore." The investigation revealed Mason Sterling's financial situation in 1994 had been dire. Though he projected success and confidence, records showed he owed $40,000 to various creditors, including some dangerous people in Bozeman connected to illegal gambling. His credit cards were maxed out. His car was about to be repossessed. Yet suddenly, in March 1994, just weeks after the tragedy, he'd paid off all his debts and had enough left over to start his real estate business. He'd told people he'd received an inheritance from a distant relative, but investigators could find no record of such an inheritance. The ice fishing community in West Yellowstone still remembered that winter of 1994. It had been particularly cold, with the lake frozen solid by December. The ice was thick, safe, regularly tested by the Park Service. The day of the incident, February 12th, had been clear and cold, minus 15 degrees. No warming, no weather events that would cause ice to suddenly fail. Several experienced fishermen had been on the lake that day in the same area. None reported any ice problems. A retired park ranger named William Hartford came forward with information he'd held back in 1994. "I always thought something was off about Sterling's story," he said. "When he came into the station that night, he was cold, yes, but not hypothermic. His clothes were damp but not soaked through. If he'd been in that water, pulled himself out, and walked 7 miles in -15 weather, he should have been near death. Instead, he was coherent, walking, talking. I mentioned it to my supervisor, but Sterling was from a good family. No one wanted to accuse a survivor of lying. The forensic analysis of the truck revealed no signs of impact damage that would be consistent with breaking through ice while driving. The undercarriage showed the vehicle had been stationary when it went through. The angle of descent, based on the truck's position on the lakebed, suggested it had dropped through a hole barely larger than the vehicle itself. This wasn't consistent with natural ice failure, which typically creates irregular breaks and would cause a vehicle to list or flip as it sank. Mason Sterling's behavior in the days following the tragedy had seemed appropriate at the time, but took on new meaning in light of the evidence. He'd been the one to organize the memorial service. He'd comforted the families. He'd started a scholarship fund in his friends' names. He'd also been very specific about where search teams should look for the bodies, always directing them to the western shore, far from where the truck actually was. When spring came and the bodies weren't found, he'd been the one to suggest they must have been swept into the deepest part of the lake by underwater currents. The lighter found in the truck, the Zippo engraved with "To Mason, Love Dad, 1993, became a crucial piece of evidence. Mason had treasured that lighter. Everyone knew it. His father had died in 1993, and it was one of the last gifts he'd received from him. Mason had indeed reported it lost on the day of the tragedy, saying it must have fallen from his pocket during his desperate escape from the water. But the lighter was found inside the truck, under the dashboard on the driver's side, a place it could only have been if Mason had been inside the vehicle after the victims were incapacitated. The investigation intensified as detectives began reconstructing the events of February 12, 1994. The cassette tape revealed more than just casual conversation. When audio experts enhanced the recording, they detected something disturbing in the background. Around noon, the voices of Daniel and Christopher became noticeably slurred. Teddy could be heard asking if they were feeling all right. Mason's voice remained clear and steady throughout, reassuring everyone that it was just the altitude and cold affecting them. The recording continued sporadically until 2:10 p.m., when it abruptly stopped mid-sentence. Financial forensics revealed the full scope of Teddy's cash operation. Bank records showed no large deposits, but investigators found references to a hidden safe in his apartment. When they shared this with Evelyn Blackwood, she remembered something crucial. "Teddy never told me the combination," she said, "but he was paranoid about Mason finding out about it. He'd changed the combination the week before he died. Said he didn't trust anyone with that much cash lying around." The pattern of holes in the ice, visible in Christopher's final photographs, told a precise story. An ice fishing expert examined the images and identified them as relief holes, cuts made to weaken a specific section of ice in a controlled manner. Someone who knew what they were doing could predict exactly where and when that ice would fail, he explained. Cut the holes in the right pattern, let them freeze over with a thin layer, and you've created a trap that looks completely safe but will collapse under weight. Mason Sterling continued to cooperate fully with investigators, providing detailed statements about that day. But now, 30 years later, inconsistencies emerged. In 1994, he'd said they were fishing the western shore when the ice broke. Now, confronted with the truck's actual location, he claimed trauma must have confused his memory. He'd originally stated the accident happened around 3 p.m., but the stopped watches suggested earlier. When asked about the timeline, Mason adjusted his story, saying everything from that day was a blur. The investigation uncovered another witness from 1994 who had never been interviewed. Robert Chen, a photographer from National Geographic, had been documenting winter wildlife in Yellowstone that February. His detailed journal placed him on the northern section of the lake on February 12th. He remembered seeing a truck on the ice and one person walking away from it around 2:45 p.m. "I thought it was strange," Chen recalled. "The person was walking calmly, not running, not panicked. They had what looked like an ice auger over their shoulder. I was too far away to see faces, but I remember thinking it was too early to leave. Prime fishing time was still hours away. The forensic examination of the remains, while limited by 3 decades underwater, revealed traces of a sedative in hair samples from all 3 victims. The substance, identified as a prescription sleeping medication, wouldn't have been fatal, but would have caused severe drowsiness and impaired judgment. Combined with cold temperatures, it would have made the victims extremely vulnerable. The medication was commonly prescribed in 1994, and pharmacy records from that era were largely destroyed, making it impossible to trace its source. Mason's alibi for the hours before the tragedy began to crumble. He'd claimed to have picked up supplies that morning, but the owner of the sporting goods store had no record or memory of seeing him. The coffee shop where he supposedly bought the thermos of coffee had been closed that day for repairs. These details hadn't been checked in 1994 when Mason was viewed as a traumatized survivor, not a suspect. The missing ice auger became a focal point of the investigation. Every ice fisherman owned one, but Teddy's distinctive red-handled auger had never been found. It wasn't in the truck. It wasn't recovered from the lake during the 1994 search. But investigators located a pawnshop receipt from Billings, Montana, dated February 18, 1994, 6 days after the tragedy. Someone matching Mason's description had sold a red-handled ice auger for $50 cash. The pawnshop owner still had the security footage archived on old VHS tapes. Daniel Rivers' family provided investigators with letters he'd written home that winter. In one, dated February 3, 1994, he mentioned tensions in the friend group. "Mason owes money to some rough people," Daniel wrote. "Teddy offered to help, but Mason got angry, said he didn't need charity. He keeps making jokes about how Teddy's secret cash stash could solve everyone's problems. Teddy doesn't think Mason knows about the money, but I'm not so sure." The investigation revealed that Mason had made several unusual purchases in the days before the tragedy. Hardware store receipts showed he'd bought rope, plastic sheeting, and waterproof bags. When questioned, he explained these were for winter camping gear. He'd also filled multiple gas cans, supposedly for emergency supplies. None of these items were found in his apartment after the incident, and he claimed they must have been in Teddy's truck when it sank. Evelyn Blackwood remembered another crucial detail. The night before the fishing trip, Mason had insisted on joining them at the last minute. Originally, it was just supposed to be Teddy, Daniel, and Christopher, she said. Mason called Friday night, said he'd cleared his schedule and really needed to get out on the ice to clear his head. Teddy didn't want him to come. They'd been arguing about money. But Mason could be very persuasive. He even offered to bring breakfast and coffee for everyone. The enhanced audio from the cassette recorder revealed another disturbing detail. In the background of one section, barely audible, was the sound of an engine running. But the friends were all supposedly outside the truck, fishing. Timestamps on the recording matched with the stopped watches, suggesting the truck's engine was running while the victims were still inside, approximately 20 minutes before Mason claimed the accident occurred. Carbon monoxide in an enclosed space combined with sedatives would have rendered the victims unconscious without violence. Weather data from February 12, 1994, contradicted Mason's version of events. He'd described worsening conditions, wind picking up, temperatures rising dangerously, all factors that could cause ice failure. But meteorological records showed it had been one of the coldest, calmest days of that winter. The temperature never rose above -10. Wind speed was negligible, barometric pressure was steady. Perfect conditions for ice fishing, terrible conditions for Mason's story of a natural accident. The scholarship fund Mason had established in his friends' names took on new significance. Financial records showed he'd made the initial donation of exactly $50,000, the same amount Teddy had supposedly accumulated from his illegal guide service. The fund had been Mason's springboard into legitimate business, giving him connections and credibility in the community. He'd built his fortune on a foundation of his friends' money and deaths. A former girlfriend of Mason's from that era, Harper Lawson, came forward with information she'd been too frightened to share in 1994. Mason had been acting strange that whole winter, she revealed. He was desperate, scared. He owed money to dangerous people. The week before the fishing trip, he said something that chilled me. He said, "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good." I thought he was being dramatic about his financial troubles. After the accident, I convinced myself it meant nothing. The digital enhancement of Christopher's final photographs revealed even more detail. In one image, partially obscured by fishing gear, was a pair of boots, dry boots, standing on solid ice at a time when Mason claimed to have been in the water trying to save his friends. The boots matched a pair Mason was wearing in earlier photos from that day. In another photo, a thermos was visible in the truck's cab, its lid off, cups scattered on the dashboard, as if there had been a struggle to stay conscious. Investigators discovered that Mason had taken out life insurance policies on both Teddy and Daniel just months before their deaths. As business partners in a supposed future venture, it wasn't entirely unusual, but the timing was suspicious. The policies paid out $25,000 each to the surviving partner. Mason had collected the money in April 1994, adding another $50,000 to his newfound wealth. The insurance company had investigated briefly, but found no evidence of foul play based on the information available at the time. The pawnshop VHS footage, though grainy and damaged, was restored using modern techniques. The man selling the ice auger was definitely Mason Sterling. He could be seen chatting casually with the shop owner, no signs of trauma or grief, despite having supposedly lost 3 close friends just days earlier. The timestamp showed 2:30 p.m., a time when Mason had told investigators he was at home, incapacitated by grief and survivor's guilt. Phone records from 1994, archived by the telephone company, showed Mason had made several calls from a payphone in Billings on February 18th, the same day he'd pawned the ice auger. One call was to a known criminal enforcer in Bozeman, likely paying off his gambling debts. Another was to a real estate office in Jackson Hole, inquiring about commercial properties. The grieving survivor had been planning his future while his friends' families were still hoping for a miracle. As investigators assembled the timeline, Mason's story completely collapsed. He hadn't been a desperate friend trying to save his companions. The evidence painted a picture of calculated, premeditated murder. The sedatives in the coffee, the carefully cut holes in the ice, the carbon monoxide poisoning, the staged accident scene. It all pointed to a man who had killed 3 friends for money. But proving it in court, 30 years later, would require an airtight case. The smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Theodore Frost's truck, preserved by the cold water, yielded one more piece of evidence. Under the driver's seat, investigators found a small digital recorder, cutting-edge technology for 1994. Unlike the cassette recorder, this device had been hidden, apparently by Teddy, who had grown suspicious of Mason. The recording it contained was short, but damning. The digital recorder contained a conversation from February 11, 1994, the night before the tragedy. Teddy's voice was clear. "I know you've been in my apartment, Mason. Things have been moved. You're looking for something." Mason's response was chilling in its calmness. "You're paranoid, Teddy. We're friends." But Teddy pressed on. "Friends don't owe 40 grand to Tommy Marcetti. Friends don't joke about accidents happening on the ice. I know what you're thinking, and it won't work." The recording ended with Mason's voice, cold and flat. "You have no idea what I'm thinking." This recording changed everything. It showed premeditation, motive, and Teddy's awareness of danger. Investigators immediately moved to arrest Mason Sterling, but when they arrived at his Jackson Hole office, they found he'd left the country 2 days after the truck was discovered. His secretary said he'd claimed it was a long-planned business trip to Costa Rica, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States for crimes committed before 1995. The investigation continued without Mason's presence. Forensic accountants traced the $50,000 from Teddy's safe through a complex web of transactions. On February 13, 1994, the day after the murders, someone had accessed Teddy's apartment using his key. The safe had been opened with the correct combination, a combination only Teddy supposedly knew. But investigators found Teddy's journal contained a hidden clue. He'd written the numbers in the margins of different pages, disguised as fishing catch records. Mason, who had often borrowed the journal to learn Teddy's spots, would have had opportunity to piece it together. The medical examiner's final report confirmed what the evidence suggested. All 3 victims showed signs of sedative ingestion approximately 2 hours before death. The positioning of the bodies indicated they were unconscious when the truck entered the water. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no attempts to escape. The cause of death was determined to be drowning, but they were already deeply unconscious when it happened. It was murder disguised as an accident, executed with cold precision. Christopher Winter's parents, now in their 80s, had kept everything from their son's final semester at college. Among his belongings, investigators found letters he'd written but never sent. One, addressed to his girlfriend, described his excitement about the fishing trip, but also his unease about Mason. "He asks too many questions about Teddy's business," Christopher wrote. "Teddy told me to be careful around him, not to mention the cash. There's something desperate in Mason's eyes lately." The forensic team made another crucial discovery. The ice holes visible in Christopher's photographs matched perfectly with a library book Mason had checked out 2 weeks before the murders. Ice Fishing Techniques and Safety. Chapter 7 detailed how to safely create multiple holes for commercial fishing operations. But someone had annotated the margins with pencil, notes about weight distribution, failure points, and timing. The handwriting matched Mason Sterling's. From Costa Rica, Mason released a statement through his lawyer. He maintained his innocence, claiming the investigation was a witch hunt. He insisted the evidence was circumstantial, that his financial recovery after his friends' deaths was coincidental, that his leaving the country was unrelated to the investigation. But he refused to return to face charges, citing concerns about receiving a fair trial after so much time had passed. The 3 families finally had answers, though justice remained elusive. Daniel Rivers' sister, now 55, spoke at a press conference. "For 30 years, we believed this was a tragic accident. We grieved, but we also felt guilty for being angry at Daniel for taking risks on the ice. Now we know he was murdered by someone he trusted. Mason Sterling didn't just kill 3 young men. He let 3 families torture themselves with what-ifs for 3 decades. Investigators uncovered one more piece of Mason's deception. The hypothermia he'd presented at the ranger station hadn't been from falling through ice. Medical records showed his core temperature was consistent with someone who'd been outside in cold weather, but not immersed in freezing water. He'd likely sat in his car with the heater off just long enough to become convincingly cold, then walked to the station with his prepared story of survival and tragedy. The community of West Yellowstone struggled to process the revelation. Mason Sterling had been a respected figure, his business success seen as triumph over tragedy. The scholarship fund he'd created had helped dozens of local students attend college. His donations to search and rescue operations were legendary. All of it built on blood money, funded by the murders of 3 young men who had trusted him. Tommy Marcetti, the Bozeman criminal Mason had owed money to in 1994, was now serving life in federal prison for unrelated crimes. When investigators interviewed him, he laughed bitterly. "Sterling paid me in full on February 20th, 1994. Cash. Exact amount, not a dollar more or less. I always wondered how he got it so fast. He'd been dodging me for months, then suddenly he had 40 grand in small bills. Now I know. He killed for it." The murder weapon had been sophisticated in its simplicity. No guns, no knives, no violence that would leave traces. Just sleeping pills dissolved in coffee, carefully placed ice holes, and time. Mason had created the perfect murder scene, one that looked like an accident to investigators who had no reason to suspect foul play. If the truck hadn't been found, if technology hadn't advanced to enhance old recordings and photographs, he would have gotten away with it completely. Evelyn Blackwood revealed one final detail that haunted investigators. The morning of February 12th, she'd had breakfast with Teddy. He was nervous, she recalled. He kept saying he had a bad feeling about the trip. I told him to cancel, but he said he couldn't. Mason really needed this, needed friends around him. Even suspicious of Mason's intentions, Teddy still tried to be a good friend. That's the kind of person Mason murdered, someone who was trying to help him despite everything. The investigation revealed the full extent of Mason's planning. He'd studied ice conditions for weeks, choosing the perfect spot where the truck would sink into the deepest part of the lake. He'd tested the sedative dosage on himself to ensure it would incapacitate but not be immediately fatal. He'd even practiced cutting ice holes at night when no one would see him. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was methodical execution. International efforts to extradite Mason Sterling continued, but legal experts were pessimistic. Costa Rica's refusal to extradite for older crimes, combined with questions about evidence degradation after 30 years, made prosecution challenging. Mason had chosen his refuge carefully, just as he'd planned the murders. He lived in a beachfront villa, built with money that had originated from Teddy Frost's illegal cash business and life insurance policies on the dead. The case files revealed how close investigators had come to the truth in 1994. One detective had noted irregularities in Mason's story, the convenient timing of his financial recovery, the missing ice auger. But without bodies or evidence of foul play, the case had been classified as an accident. That detective, now retired, came forward to express his regret. "I knew something was wrong," he said. But Mason was so convincing as the grieving survivor. He cried at all the right moments, said all the right things. He played us perfectly. The enhanced audio revealed one more heartbreaking detail. In the final minutes of the cassette recording, Teddy's voice could be heard, slurred but determined. "Mason, what did you do? What's in the coffee?" Then Daniel, can't move right. And Christopher, the youngest, simply saying, "Why?" Mason's voice responded calmly, "Just close your eyes. It'll be over soon." Then the sound of the truck engine starting, the doors locking, and finally, silence. Modern DNA analysis of the truck's interior found Mason's genetic material everywhere, on the steering wheel, the gearshift, the door handles. This contradicted his claim of never being in the truck that day. His DNA was even on the seatbelts that held the victims in place as the truck sank. Prosecutors built their case methodically. Mason had drugged his friends, driven the truck onto weakened ice he'd prepared in advance, secured the unconscious men in their seats, and escaped through the driver's door as the vehicle sank. The Yellowstone Lake murders, as they became known, sparked changes in cold case investigations across Wyoming. The case demonstrated how modern technology could solve decades-old crimes, but also how killers could exploit international law to avoid justice. Mason Sterling remained free in Costa Rica, posting occasionally on social media about his wonderful retirement, each post a mockery of justice for 3 families. In a final twist, investigators discovered Mason had made one crucial mistake. The Zippo lighter found in the truck contained a partial fingerprint on the inside of the lid, a print that matched Mason's left thumb. But more importantly, the lighter contained traces of the same sedative found in the victim's systems. Mason had apparently used the lighter's small storage compartment to carry the pills, not realizing that residue would remain. This evidence directly linked him to the drugging of his victims. The families of Teddy Frost, Daniel Rivers, and Christopher Winters held a memorial service at Yellowstone Lake on the 30th anniversary of the murders. They threw flowers onto the water where their loved ones had died, not in an accident as they'd believed for 3 decades, but as victims of a calculated betrayal. Daniel's mother, now 81, spoke for all of them. Mason Sterling stole more than 3 lives. He stole 30 years of truth from us. We lived with false guilt, false assumptions, false closure. But now we know our boys didn't die because of bad luck or poor judgment. They died because they trusted the wrong friend. The investigation officially remains open, with an arrest warrant active for Mason Sterling. Prosecutors believe that if he ever returns to the United States, even decades from now, they have enough evidence for conviction. The cassette recording, the digital recording of threats, the enhanced photographs, the DNA evidence, the sedative traces, and the pattern of financial gain create an overwhelming case for premeditated murder. From his Costa Rican exile, Mason made one final statement through his attorney. "I maintain my innocence and mourn my friends every day. The real tragedy is that their families have been convinced to blame me for an accident that destroyed my life too." But investigators noted that Mason's destroyed life included a net worth of over $10 million, all traceable back to that initial $50,000 in blood money he'd stolen from his victims in February 1994. The case had one unexpected positive outcome. The scholarship fund Mason had created with his victims' money was restructured by court order. Now renamed the Frost Rivers Winters Memorial Fund, it continued to help local students, but with a new mission statement. In memory of 3 young men whose trust was betrayed, this fund supports education in criminal justice, ensuring future generations can seek truth and justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Christopher Winter's final photograph, the one showing Mason with the ice auger standing among the pre-cut holes, became the defining image of the case. It captured the moment just before 3 friends were murdered, when Mason Sterling was making his final preparations, knowing that within minutes he would kill the 3 people who trusted him most. The photograph now hangs in the Wyoming Law Enforcement Museum as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. The investigation concluded with a sobering statistic. If the truck hadn't been discovered by chance due to climate change causing unusual ice melt, Mason Sterling would have taken his secret to the grave. 3 families would never have known the truth. A killer would have lived his entire life, free and wealthy, built on the foundation of a triple murder. As the lead investigator noted in his final report, this case proves that time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just hides them under 60 feet of water. The Yellowstone Lake murders remain one of Wyoming's most shocking cold cases, not because of their brutality, but because of their calculated cruelty. Mason Sterling had looked into the eyes of 3 trusting friends, served them poisoned coffee with a smile, and watched them slowly lose consciousness before sending them to their deaths. Then he'd spent 30 years playing the grieving survivor, accepting condolences from the families he'd destroyed, building his fortune on their graves. As of 2024, Mason Sterling remains free in Costa Rica, now 53 years old and wealthy. The 3 men he murdered would have been 52, 54, and 51. They never got to have careers, families, or futures. They died at 21, 22, and 24, betrayed by someone they'd tried to help despite their suspicions. The case serves as a chilling reminder that some secrets can stay hidden for decades, waiting beneath the ice for the truth to finally surface. The waters of Yellowstone Lake have given up their secret, but justice remains as frozen as the winter ice of 1994.